The Gospel of Philip, discovered in 1945 among the Nag Hammadi texts, contains a passage that every major Christian denomination has systematically ignored for nearly 2,000 years. In Logian 63, Philip describes a ritual practice performed on what we now call Valentine's Day that has nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with accessing divine feminine consciousness through specific breathing techniques combined with plant essences. This isn't metaphor. This isn't ancient poetry. This is a literal instruction manual for a psycho-spiritual technology that early Christian mystics used to directly experience the sacred feminine principle that the patriarchal church has spent centuries erasing. The text reads, "In the days when the earth awakens from winter's death, when Lupercalia gives way to the feast of the Holy Bride, those who would know the mother's breath must gather the first blooming almond, steep it in spring water under the constellation of the Virgin, and breathe the essence while reciting the names of Sophia 7 times 7. Modern scholars dismiss this as symbolic language, but the early church fathers knew exactly what Philip was describing: a direct transmission technique for accessing what they called the logos of the feminine divine. They buried it because a population capable of direct spiritual experience doesn't need institutional control. The reason the church transformed February 14th from Lupercalia, a fertility festival honouring the goddess Juno Februta, into St. Valentine's Day wasn't to promote romantic love. It was to sever your connection to a specific annual window when the Earth's electromagnetic field aligns with solar patterns in a way that dramatically amplifies the effectiveness of feminine principle spiritual practices. The Archons, as the Gnostics called the controlling forces, understood that cutting humanity off from cyclical goddess worship would create a spiritually malnourished population dependent on external salvation, rather than direct gnosis. What you're about to learn in the next 2 hours will fundamentally alter how you understand both Christianity's hidden roots and your own capacity for direct spiritual transmission. You'll discover the exact breathing technique encoded in Philip's Gospel, why almond essence specifically triggers neurochemical states that ancient practitioners called Sophia consciousness, and how to use the annual February 14th energy window to establish a permanent connection with the divine feminine principle that operates through your nervous system. This isn't theory. By the end of this presentation, you'll have practiced the core technique and experienced measurable shifts in your awareness that you can verify independently. The historical suppression of goddess spirituality wasn't accidental, it was surgical. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, teams of church scholars led by figures like Jerome and Augustine systematically reviewed every text, practice, and tradition associated with early Christian communities. They kept what supported centralized authority and destroyed what empowered individual spiritual autonomy. The Gospel of Philip survived only because it was hidden in a ceramic jar in the Egyptian desert for 16 centuries. The February 14th Lupercalia festival originally honoured Juno Februata, whose name derives from the Latin februa, meaning to purify. But this purification wasn't moral or behavioural, it was neurological. Ancient practitioners understood that specific seasonal transitions created optimal conditions for what modern neuroscience recognizes as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways. The goddess festivals weren't primitive superstition. They were sophisticated psycho-spiritual technologies that used astronomical timing, plant medicine, and breath work to induce lasting changes in consciousness. The Gospel of Philip's breathing technique works because it synchronizes what ancient texts call the breath of the mother, with modern research identifies as the parasympathetic nervous system's capacity for neurochemical regulation. When early Christian mystics wrote about receiving the breath of Sophia, they were describing a reproducible method for activating the vagus nerve complex through specific rhythmic breathing patterns, while the nervous system is primed by plant essences that increase GABA receptor sensitivity. Archaeological evidence from early Christian communities in Egypt and Syria shows that goddess-honouring practices continued well into the 4th century, often integrated with Jesus-centred worship. Coptic papyri describe February rituals where practitioners would gather before dawn, prepare almond and myrrh extracts, and engage in group-breathing practices designed to birth the Christ consciousness through the mother's womb. These weren't fringe practices, they were central to how early Christians understood spiritual development. The Church's suppression campaign was thorough but not perfect. Hidden in orthodox liturgical calendars, embedded in saint stories, and preserved in mystical texts like Hildegard of Bingen's writings, the goddess wisdom survived in fragments. Hildegard's Scivias contains detailed descriptions of what she calls viriditas, the divine feminine life force that can be accessed through seasonal rituals involving specific plant essences and breathing techniques. Her feast day, February 17th, exactly 3 days after the original Lupercalia peak. Modern practitioners who've reconstructed these techniques report consistent experiences, enhanced intuition, improved emotional regulation, deeper spiritual receptivity, and what many describe as a felt sense of connection to a benevolent feminine presence that provides ongoing guidance. These aren't placebo effects, they're the predictable result of practices that work with, rather than against, the nervous system's natural capacity for mystical states. The February 14th window remains energetically potent because it marks a specific point in the Earth's orbit, where solar radiation patterns interact with the planet's magnetic field in ways that early astronomers called the Virgin's Awakening. Modern space weather research confirms that mid-February consistently shows increased geomagnetic activity that correlates with heightened human psycho-spiritual receptivity. The goddess festivals weren't arbitrary. They were precisely timed to astronomical phenomena that ancient observers understood enhanced human consciousness. The Gospel of Philip's almond essence instruction isn't random either. Almond blossoms contain benzaldehyde and other aromatic compounds that, when properly extracted and inhaled during specific breathing patterns, cross the blood-brain barrier and influence neurotransmitter production. Ancient practitioners called this breathing the mother's love, but modern aromatherapy research demonstrates measurable anxiolytic and consciousness-expanding effects from almond blossom essences when combined with controlled breathing techniques. The Church Fathers understood the power of these practices because many of them had experienced the techniques directly during their years as pagan philosophers before converting to Christianity. Augustine's Confessions contains veiled references to goddess practices he learned during his involvement with Manichaean communities. Jerome's letters mention purification rituals of the February goddess that he clearly practiced before dismissing them as demonic. They weren't destroying practices they didn't understand, they were eliminating practices they knew worked too well. The transformation of Lupercalia into Valentine's Day represents one of history's most successful spiritual hijackings. Instead of empowering individuals to directly access divine feminine wisdom through embodied practice, the Church created a commercialized festival of romantic dependency that keeps people seeking external validation rather than internal communion. The shift from God's worship to romantic obsession isn't accidental. It's a deliberate redirection of spiritual energy into consumer behavior and emotional codependency. The Gnostic texts consistently warn about what they call archonic inversion, the systematic reversal of empowering spiritual practices into disempowering psychological patterns. Valentine's Day exemplifies this perfectly. Ancient practices designed to cultivate inner divine feminine connection became a cultural ritual that promotes anxious attachment and material consumption. The archons, as the Gnostics described these controlling influences, don't need to destroy spiritual practices. They just need to invert their purpose. But the original practices remain accessible to anyone willing to move beyond cultural conditioning and engage with the actual techniques. The Gospel of Philip's breathing method, properly understood and practiced, provides a direct pathway to the consciousness states that early Christians called bridal chamber experiences, unitive awareness that transcends the subject-object dualism that keeps most people feeling spiritually isolated. The text instruction to gather first blooming almond isn't merely poetic. It specifies almond blossoms that appear in late January through mid-February, precisely when the tree's essential oil composition reaches optimal potency for consciousness expansion effects. Ancient practitioners understood plant medicine timing with precision that modern aromatherapy is only beginning to rediscover. They weren't working with superstition. They were applying sophisticated knowledge of how botanical compounds interact with human neurology during specific seasonal windows. The spring water under the constellation of the Virgin instruction refers to water collected during the early morning hours when Virgo is visible on the eastern horizon, approximately between 4 and 6 a.m. in mid-February. Ancient astronomers knew that stellar positions correlate with terrestrial magnetic field variations that affect how water maintains subtle energetic properties. Modern research into water's capacity for maintaining electromagnetic signatures confirms that water collected during specific astronomical conditions retains different molecular structures than water collected randomly. The practice of reciting the names of Sophia 7 times 7 provides the rhythmic structure for a breathing technique that ancient practitioners called the Mother's Breath. Sophia's traditional names, Wisdom, Holy Spirit, Divine Mother, Sacred Feminine, Bride of God, Queen of Heaven, and Source of Life, create a 7-breath cycle repeated 7 times, producing a 49-breath sequence that synchronizes with natural brainwave entrainment patterns. Modern biofeedback research demonstrates that 49 breath-rhythmic breathing sessions consistently induce alpha-theta brainwave states associated with enhanced creativity, spiritual receptivity, and emotional integration. Early Christian communities practiced these techniques collectively during what they called Vigils of the Holy Bride, all-night gatherings that began on February 13th and culminated at dawn on February 14th. Coptic texts describe these vigils as combining the individual breathing practice with group chanting, sharing of plant essences, and periods of silent communion that participants experienced as direct encounters with divine feminine presence. These weren't worship services in the modern sense. They were practical training sessions for accessing expanded consciousness states. The Church's suppression of goddess practices created a massive spiritual wound in Western consciousness that continues to influence how people relate to the sacred feminine today. Instead of understanding the divine feminine as an accessible aspect of consciousness that can be cultivated through embodied practice, most spiritual seekers either idealize feminine archetypes from a distance or reject feminine spirituality entirely as patriarchal manipulation. Both responses miss the practical core. The divine feminine isn't a concept to believe in, but a consciousness state to cultivate. The Gospel of Philip's technique works because it engages what ancient practitioners called the 3 gates of the mother: the breath, the senses, and the heart. Modern neuroscience recognizes these as the respiratory system, the limbic system, and the cardiovascular system. 3 interconnected networks that, when synchronized through specific practices, produce measurable shifts in consciousness that practitioners experience as spiritual communion. The breathing component activates the vagus nerve complex, which ancient texts describe as the pathway of the spirit's descent. The plant essence component engages the olfactory system's direct connection to the limbic brain, which processes both smell and mystical experiences through overlapping neural networks. The heart-opening component, cultivated through the rhythmic recitation of Sophia's names, entrains cardiac coherence patterns that facilitate what researchers call psychophysiological coherence, a state where heart, mind, and emotions function in energetic alignment. Ancient practitioners understood that consciousness isn't located in the brain, but emerges from the interaction between multiple body systems functioning in coherent relationship. The goddess practices weren't primitive. They were sophisticated applications of what modern science calls embodied cognition, the recognition that consciousness arises from the whole body's intelligent functioning, not just mental activity. The February timing remains crucial because the seasonal transition from winter to spring creates optimal conditions for neuroplasticity and psychological transformation. Ancient astronomers tracked what they called the Virgin Season, the period from late January through mid-March when solar activity patterns and terrestrial magnetic fields create enhanced conditions for consciousness expansion. Modern chronobiology research confirms that late winter and early spring show increased rates of neural growth factor production and enhanced brain plasticity. The Church's replacement of goddess festivals with saints' days wasn't random. It was a systematic effort to redirect seasonal spiritual practices away from direct experience and toward institutional dependency. Every major goddess festival was overlaid with a saint story that maintained the timing while eliminating the empowering practices. Valentine's Day represents the most successful of these replacements because it completely inverted the original practice's purpose while maintaining its emotional intensity. Instead of cultivating inner divine feminine connection through breathwork and plant medicine, modern Valentine's Day promotes anxious seeking for external romantic validation through material consumption. Instead of honouring the goddess principle as an accessible aspect of consciousness, the holiday encourages idealization of romantic partners as sources of spiritual completion. The archonic inversion is complete. A practice designed to cultivate inner wholeness became a cultural ritual that reinforces inner emptiness. But the original practices retain their power for anyone willing to move beyond cultural conditioning and engage with the actual techniques. The Gospel of Philip's method provides a direct pathway to what early Christians called the bridal chamber, mystical union between individual consciousness and the divine feminine principle that operates through the nervous system. Hildegard of Bingen, writing in the 12th century, preserved detailed descriptions of what she called the living light, experiences that resulted from goddess-honouring practices. Her writings contain specific instructions for combining almond essence inhalation with rhythmic breathing, while focusing on what she describes as the verdant force that births all creation. Modern practitioners using a reconstructed techniques report consistent experiences of enhanced intuition, emotional healing, and direct spiritual guidance. The technique's effectiveness doesn't depend on belief in any particular theological framework. Buddhist practitioners adapt it as a method for cultivating Tara consciousness. Hindu practitioners recognize it as a form of Shakti sadhana. Modern secular practitioners describe it as a neurofeedback technique for accessing expanded awareness states. The practice works because it engages universal principles of nervous system function and consciousness development that transcend cultural and religious boundaries. The Gospel of Philip contains additional instructions for extending the basic practice into a year-long spiritual development program. The text describes monthly practices aligned with lunar cycles and seasonal transitions that build on the foundation established during the February intensive. These extended practices transform the initial experience into a stable capacity for accessing divine feminine wisdom as an ongoing resource for daily life decisions and spiritual development. Ancient Christian communities understood that spiritual development required both intensive breakthrough experiences and sustained daily practice. The February Goddess Festival provided the intensive component, a concentrated window for establishing direct connection with divine feminine consciousness. The monthly and seasonal practices provided the sustainability component, ongoing techniques for maintaining and deepening that connection throughout the year. Modern practitioners following this ancient curriculum report progressive development over months and years. Initial experiences typically involve enhanced emotional regulation and increased intuitive capacity. Intermediate practitioners develop what they describe as ongoing access to inner guidance and healing presence. Advanced practitioners report what ancient texts call the marriage of the soul, permanent integration of divine feminine and masculine principles within individual consciousness. The practice's long-term benefits extend beyond spiritual development into practical life enhancement. Practitioners consistently report improved relationships, enhanced creativity, better decision-making capacity, and increased resilience during challenging circumstances. These aren't placebo effects. They're the predictable results of practices that optimize nervous system function and develop previously dormant capacities for information processing and emotional intelligence. The Church's suppression of goddess spirituality created cultural trauma that affects how modern people approach feminine spiritual practices. Many seekers either romanticize goddess traditions without understanding their practical components, or reject them entirely as historically inaccurate reconstructions. Both responses miss the essential point. Ancient goddess practices were sophisticated technologies for consciousness development that remain effective regardless of historical or theological beliefs. The Gospel of Philip's technique represents one specific method within a vast tradition of goddess-honouring practices that spanned multiple cultures and centuries. Similar breathing techniques combined with plant essences appear in Celtic Brigid traditions, Mediterranean Sibyl mysteries, Egyptian Isis practices, and Germanic Freya rituals. The universality of these practices suggests they're based on discoverable principles of human consciousness rather than culture-specific beliefs. Modern neuroscience research into mystical experiences confirms that specific combinations of breathing techniques, aromatic compounds, and rhythmic mental activities consistently produce measurable brain state changes associated with expanded awareness, enhanced empathy, and increased psychological integration. Ancient practitioners discovered these combinations through centuries of careful observation and practical experimentation. The goddess traditions preserve their discoveries in ritual forms that modern practitioners can adapt for contemporary use. The February 14th window retains its effectiveness because astronomical and geological factors that influenced ancient practitioners continue operating today. Earth's orbital position during mid-February creates consistent patterns of solar radiation exposure and geomagnetic activity that correlate with enhanced human psycho-spiritual receptivity. Ancient astronomers tracked these patterns with precision that modern space weather research is confirming and expanding. The practice requires no special equipment or elaborate preparation. Almond blossoms can be obtained from health food stores or online suppliers. Spring water refers to any naturally occurring water source, including filtered tap water that's been exposed to morning sunlight. The breathing technique uses normal respiratory capacity with specific timing and attention patterns that anyone can learn. The accessibility of these practices explains why early Christian authorities worked so systematically to eliminate them. Empowered individuals don't require institutional mediation for spiritual development. The Gospel of Philip's instructions conclude with what ancient practitioners called the Mother's Promise, the assurance that anyone who engages these practices with consistent devotion will develop ongoing access to divine feminine wisdom that operates through their daily life circumstances. This isn't supernatural intervention, but natural development of consciousness capacities that remain dormant until activated through specific practices. Modern quantum physics research into consciousness suggests that individual awareness exists in constant interaction with larger information fields that ancient traditions called divine presence. the goddess practices appear to function as techniques for developing sensitivity to these subtler information streams and learning to interpret their guidance for practical decision-making and spiritual development. The Church's transformation of goddess festivals into romantic holidays reflects a deeper cultural pattern of redirecting spiritual energies into consumer behaviors and emotional dependencies. Instead of developing inner resources for accessing wisdom and healing, modern culture promotes seeking these capacities through external relationships and material acquisitions. The shift from goddess practices to romantic idealization represents one example of what Gnostics called archonic substitution, the replacement of empowering practices with disempowering behaviors that maintain psychological and spiritual dependency. But the original practices remain available to anyone willing to move beyond cultural programming and engage with actual techniques. The Gospel of Philip's method provides a practical pathway to experiences that early Christians described as tasting the powers of the age to come, direct access to consciousness capacities that represent humanity's developmental potential rather than supernatural intervention. Contemporary practitioners adapting ancient goddess techniques often experience initial resistance from psychological patterns conditioned by patriarchal religious and cultural influences. Working with divine feminine consciousness can trigger unconscious fears about losing control, appearing irrational, or abandoning familiar spiritual frameworks. These resistances are normal parts of the developmental process that ancient practitioners addressed through community support and gradual practice progression. The Gospel of Philip emphasizes that goddess practices work most effectively within supportive community contexts, where practitioners can share experiences and receive guidance from others who've developed more advanced capacities. Early Christian communities organized around these practices created extended spiritual families that provided ongoing support for individual development while maintaining connection with larger traditions of wisdom and practice. Modern practitioners often adapt ancient community models by forming small practice groups that meet regularly to engage collective versions of the techniques and provide mutual support for individual development. Online communities also serve this function, allowing practitioners from different geographical locations to share experiences and receive guidance from more experienced practitioners. The technique's effectiveness increases with consistent practice over time. Initial experiences often involve subtle shifts in awareness and emotional tone that become more pronounced with regular engagement. Most practitioners notice significant changes within 30 days of daily practice, with major transformations typically emerging over months and years of sustained commitment. The Gospel of Philip contains warnings about attempting to rush the developmental process through excessive practice, or by combining the techniques with other consciousness-altering substances. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual development requires careful pacing that allows the nervous system to integrate new capacities gradually without overwhelming its adaptive resources. The breathing technique specifically works with what ancient texts call the rhythm of the mother's heart, breathing patterns that synchronize individual consciousness with larger rhythmic cycles operating through natural systems. Modern research into cardiac coherence and respiratory entrainment confirms that specific breathing rhythms can synchronize multiple body systems in ways that enhance overall health and consciousness function. The plant essence component draws on sophisticated understanding of how aromatic compounds interact with human neurology to facilitate expanded awareness states. Ancient practitioners knew that almond blossoms contain specific molecular signatures that, when properly extracted and inhaled during focused breathing, create optimal conditions for accessing what they called Sophia consciousness, direct knowing that transcends ordinary mental processes. The recitation component provides rhythmic structure that helps maintain focus during the breathing practice while engaging what ancient practitioners called the power of sacred names. Modern research into mantras and repetitive prayer confirms that rhythmic verbal practices create measurable brain state changes that facilitate mystical experiences and psychological integration. The complete practice integrates breathing, aromatic stimulation, and rhythmic recitation into a unified technology for consciousness expansion that ancient practitioners developed over centuries of careful observation and experimentation. The Gospel of Philip preserves one specific version of techniques that appear in various forms across multiple ancient cultures, suggesting universal principles of human consciousness development that transcend particular religious or cultural frameworks. The Church's suppression of these practices eliminated access to practical methods for direct spiritual experience that early Christians considered essential for mature faith development. Instead of empowering individuals to cultivate personal relationship with divine presence, institutional Christianity created dependency relationships that require external authority for spiritual validation and guidance. But the original practices retain their transformative power for contemporary practitioners willing to engage them with consistent commitment and openness to experiences that transcend ordinary psychological categories. The Gospel of Philip's technique provides a practical pathway to consciousness states that ancient practitioners considered humanity's birthright, rather than special privileges reserved for spiritual elites. The February 14th timing creates annually recurring opportunities to establish or deepen connection with divine feminine consciousness through practices that work with, rather than against, natural rhythmic cycles. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual development follows natural laws of growth and timing that can be enhanced through skillful practice, but can't be forced through willpower or artificial techniques. Modern practitioners often discover that goddess practices catalyze profound healing of cultural wounds related to feminine spirituality, sexuality, and embodied wisdom that patriarchal religious traditions have systematically devalued or demonized. Working with divine feminine consciousness often involves recovering respect for body wisdom, emotional intelligence, and intuitive knowing that complement rather than compete with mental analysis and logical reasoning. The Gospel of Philip emphasizes that goddess practices aren't exclusively for women, but represent methods for developing consciousness capacities that all humans possess regardless of gender identity. Ancient communities included male and female practitioners who understood divine feminine consciousness as referring to receptive, intuitive, and nurturing aspects of awareness that exist within all individuals rather than gender-specific characteristics. The practice's therapeutic benefits often surprise practitioners who approach it primarily for spiritual development. Regular engagement with the breathing technique consistently improves emotional regulation, reduces anxiety and depression symptoms, enhances sleep quality, and increases overall life satisfaction. These effects occur because the practice optimizes nervous system function, while developing psychological resources for managing stress and maintaining emotional balance. The technique also enhances creative and intuitive capacities in ways that benefit practical life activities. Practitioners report improved problem-solving abilities, enhanced artistic expression, better interpersonal relationships, and increased capacity for making decisions that align with deeper values rather than superficial preferences or social pressures. The Gospel of Philip describes these benefits as natural results of connecting with what ancient practitioners called the Source, the divine feminine principle that operates through all creation as the organizing intelligence that maintains universal order and supports individual development. Modern practitioners often describe similar experiences using contemporary language like flow states, intuitive intelligence, or embodied wisdom. The practice's long-term trajectory leads toward what ancient texts describe as the sacred marriage, the integration of divine feminine and masculine principles within individual consciousness. This isn't romantic partnership, but psychological wholeness that allows individuals to function from both receptive and active capacities, intuitive and analytical intelligence, emotional and mental resources in balanced relationship. Advanced practitioners often develop what they describe as ongoing access to inner guidance that provides reliable direction for major life decisions and spiritual development. This guidance emerges not as external voices, but as enhanced capacity for recognizing which choices align with deeper wisdom and which represent reactions based on conditioning or unconscious patterns. The Church's elimination of goddess practices created cultural amnesia about practical methods for accessing these consciousness capacities, leaving modern people dependent on external authorities for spiritual guidance and validation. Recovering these practices represents reclaiming spiritual autonomy that early Christians considered essential for mature faith development. The Gospel of Philip's technique provides one practical method for beginning this recovery process. Consistent engagement with the practice over months and years gradually develops the capacity for direct spiritual experience that early practitioners called gnosis, immediate knowing that transcends belief or doubt because it emerges from direct personal verification. This gnosis develops through embodied engagement with practices rather than intellectual study or emotional devotion alone. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual development requires integration of thinking, feeling, and sensing capacities through techniques that work with the whole person rather than isolated aspects of human function. The breathing technique specifically engages what ancient texts call the three centers: head, heart, and belly, through rhythmic patterns that synchronize their function and create optimal conditions for consciousness expansion. Modern somatic therapy research confirms that integrating respiratory, cardiovascular, and digestive system function enhances overall psychological health and spiritual receptivity. The almond essence component works with the olfactory system's direct connection to the limbic brain, which processes both smell and mystical experiences through overlapping neural networks. Ancient practitioners knew that specific aromatic compounds could facilitate access to consciousness states that transcend ordinary mental categories, providing direct experience of what they called divine presence. The recitation component engages vocal and auditory systems that ancient practitioners understood as gateways to what they called the realm of the word, the creative power that maintains universal order and supports individual development. Modern research into sound healing and vibrational therapy confirms that specific vocal practices create measurable effects on consciousness and overall health. The complete technique integrates these three components into a unified practice that ancient communities used for both individual development and collective spiritual experiences. Group practice of the technique often produces what participants describe as profound feelings of connection, mutual understanding, and shared access to wisdom that transcends individual knowledge or experience. The Gospel of Philip indicates that these group experiences were central to early Christian community life, providing practical foundation for the love and mutual support that characterized authentic spiritual fellowship. Instead of depending on charismatic leaders or institutional structures, communities could access ongoing spiritual guidance through collective engagement, with practices that connected them directly with divine wisdom. Modern practitioners often form small groups that meet regularly to practice adapted versions of ancient techniques, while providing mutual support for individual development. These contemporary spiritual communities often develop qualities of intimacy, authenticity, and mutual empowerment that contrast sharply with the hierarchical structures and emotional superficiality that characterize many institutional religious organizations. The practice's accessibility means that anyone can begin immediate experimentation without requiring extensive preparation, special equipment, or institutional permission. The basic breathing technique can be practiced anywhere, the plant essences can be obtained easily, and the recitation requires only willingness to speak aloud the traditional names for divine feminine consciousness. Initial experiences often involve subtle but noticeable shifts in awareness, emotional tone, and spiritual receptivity that become more pronounced with regular practice. Most practitioners notice significant changes within the first week of daily engagement, with major transformations typically emerging over months of sustained commitment. The Gospel of Philip emphasizes that consistent daily practice creates more lasting transformation than occasional intensive experiences. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual development requires gradual rewiring of nervous system patterns through regular engagement with practices rather than dramatic breakthroughs that aren't integrated into daily life patterns. The technique's simplicity reflects ancient wisdom about spiritual development. The most powerful practices often involve basic activities like breathing, smelling, and speaking that become transformative through specific applications rather than exotic procedures that require special conditions or abilities. Contemporary practitioners often discover that engaging ancient goddess practices resolves spiritual frustrations that arise from approaches that emphasize belief over experience, mental understanding over embodied knowing, or emotional inspiration over practical transformation. The Gospel of Philip's technique provides direct access to spiritual experiences that satisfy both heart and mind through engagement that produces verifiable results. The practice also addresses cultural wounds related to feminine spirituality that affect both women and men who've been conditioned by patriarchal religious traditions that devalue or demonize goddess consciousness. Developing healthy relationship with divine feminine principles often catalyzes profound healing of sexuality, creativity, and emotional expression that enhances all aspects of life experience. The February 14th timing provides annually recurring opportunities to establish or renew commitment to practices that connect individual consciousness with larger rhythmic cycles operating through natural systems. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual development requires alignment with cosmic rhythms rather than forcing personal will against natural patterns. Modern practitioners often use the Valentine's Day period to begin annual cycles of goddess practice that continue throughout the year through monthly and seasonal variations of the basic technique. This approach transforms a commercialized romantic holiday back into an opportunity for cultivating direct spiritual experience and inner development. The Gospel of Philip suggests that widespread recovery of goddess practices could catalyze collective transformation that addresses many contemporary problems rooted in disconnection from feminine wisdom and embodied intelligence. Individual practitioners often report increased capacity for environmental awareness, social justice engagement, and creative solutions to complex challenges. These broader effects occur because goddess practices develop consciousness capacities that ancient practitioners called the wisdom of the mother, intelligence that emerges from understanding interconnections between seemingly separate phenomena and recognizing long-term consequences of immediate actions. The Church's suppression of these practices eliminated cultural access to practical methods for developing such wisdom, contributing to the environmental destruction, social fragmentation, and spiritual emptiness that characterize much of modern civilization. Recovering goddess practices represents more than individual spiritual development. It's cultural healing that could support collective transformation. The Gospel of Philip's technique provides one practical method for participating in this recovery, while developing personal capacities for direct spiritual experience that transcends institutional dependency. Ancient practitioners understood that individual transformation and collective healing occur through the same processes, connecting with divine wisdom, that operates through embodied practice rather than abstract belief or emotional devotion alone. The breathing technique works by synchronizing individual consciousness with what ancient practitioners called the breath of the mother, the rhythmic patterns that maintain life throughout natural systems. Modern practitioners often discover that regular engagement with the practice enhances their sensitivity to natural rhythms and their capacity for living in alignment with ecological cycles, rather than artificial schedules imposed by industrial civilization. The almond essence component connects practitioners with what ancient traditions called the first flowering, the awakening of life force after winter dormancy that occurs throughout natural systems during late winter and early spring. Contemporary practitioners often report increased vitality, creativity and optimism during and after February practices that continues throughout the year. The recitation component involves speaking traditional names for divine feminine consciousness that connect practitioners with centuries of ancestors who use similar techniques for spiritual development. This connection often provides sense of belonging to larger traditions of wisdom and practice that transcend contemporary cultural isolation and spiritual superficiality. The complete practice integrates individual development with connection to natural rhythms, plant wisdom, and ancestral traditions in ways that address multiple forms of disconnection that characterize modern life. Regular engagement often produces what practitioners describe as feeling more whole, more grounded, and more connected in ways that enhance both spiritual development and practical life satisfaction. The Gospel of Philip indicates that these effects represent normal results of practices that work with, rather than against, the natural principles governing consciousness development. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual growth occurs through alignment with universal laws rather than transcendence of embodied existence or escape from material reality. Contemporary practitioners often discover that goddess practices enhance, rather than conflict with other spiritual traditions and therapeutic approaches. The techniques complement rather than compete with meditation practices, psychological counseling, creative expression, and social justice engagement, because they develop foundational capacities that support all forms of conscious development. The practice's integration of breathing, sensing, and speaking engages multiple aspects of human function simultaneously, creating more comprehensive transformation than approaches that focus on single dimensions of experience. Ancient practitioners understood that lasting spiritual development requires engagement of thinking, feeling, and sensing capacities through unified practices rather than separate techniques for isolated aspects of human function. Modern neuroscience research confirms that practices integrating respiratory, sensory, and vocal activities create more extensive brain changes than techniques that engage single neural networks. The Gospel of Philip's method appears to represent sophisticated understanding of consciousness development principles that contemporary science is rediscovering through technological investigation. The technique's effectiveness doesn't depend on believing any particular theological framework or historical claims about ancient practices. Buddhist practitioners adapt it as Tara meditation. Hindu practitioners recognize it as Shakti sadhana. Secular practitioners describe it as embodied mindfulness. The practice works because it engages universal principles of nervous system function, rather than culture-specific beliefs or religious doctrines. This universality explains why similar practices appear across multiple ancient traditions, and why contemporary practitioners from diverse backgrounds report consistent experiences when engaging the techniques with sustained commitment. The Gospel of Philip preserves one specific version of practices that represent discoverable principles of consciousness development rather than arbitrary religious rituals. The February timing creates optimal conditions for beginning or deepening engagement with these practices because astronomical and geological factors during mid-February consistently enhance human receptivity to consciousness expansion experiences, ancient practitioners track these cycles with precision that modern space weather research confirms and extends through technological measurement. Contemporary practitioners can enhance the practice's effectiveness by paying attention to natural rhythms and seasonal cycles throughout the year, while maintaining daily engagement with basic techniques regardless of external conditions. This approach balances optimal timing with consistent development in ways that ancient practitioners understood created the most reliable spiritual progress. The Gospel of Philip's instruction to practice when the earth awakens from winter's death refers not only to seasonal timing, but to psychological states of readiness for spiritual development. Practitioners often report that periods of personal transition, creative breakthrough, or spiritual longing create enhanced receptivity to consciousness expansion practices regardless of calendar timing. Learning to recognize and work with these internal cycles represents advanced application of ancient wisdom about spiritual development. The practices become most effective when external timing aligns with internal readiness, but consistent engagement gradually creates internal conditions that make consciousness expansion accessible throughout the year. The technique's therapeutic benefits often surprise practitioners who approach it primarily for spiritual development. Regular engagement consistently reduces anxiety and depression symptoms, improves emotional regulation, enhances sleep quality, and increases overall life satisfaction through optimizing nervous system function and developing psychological resources for managing stress. These effects occur because the practice addresses root causes of psychological distress rather than just managing symptoms. Ancient practitioners understood that most emotional and mental problems arise from disconnection from natural rhythms, embodied wisdom, and spiritual resources that remain accessible through specific practices. Modern mental health research confirms that techniques integrating breathing, sensory awareness, and meaningful vocalization create more comprehensive therapeutic benefits than approaches that address isolated symptoms through pharmaceutical or purely psychological interventions. The Gospel of Philip's method represents a holistic healing approach that treats the whole person rather than separate aspects of human function. The practice also enhances creative and intuitive capacities in ways that benefit practical life activities. Practitioners consistently report improved problem-solving abilities, enhanced artistic expression, better interpersonal relationships, and increased capacity for making decisions that align with deeper values rather than superficial preferences or social pressures. These improvements occur because goddess practices develop what ancient practitioners called the wisdom of the heart, intelligence that emerges from integration of thinking, feeling, and sensing, rather than mental analysis alone. This integrated intelligence often provides more accurate guidance for complex life decisions than purely rational approaches. The Gospel of Philip describes these capacities as natural human potentials that become accessible through practices that remove obstacles to their function, rather than adding supernatural abilities to normal consciousness. Ancient practitioners understood spiritual development as recovering innate capacities that remain dormant until activated through specific techniques. Contemporary practitioners often discover that developing these capacities through goddess practices enhances their effectiveness in professional activities, creative projects, and personal relationships, because integrated intelligence provides more complete information for navigating complex situations than fragmented approaches that rely on single perspectives. The practice's long-term trajectory leads toward what ancient texts describe as the sacred marriage, psychological integration that allows individuals to function from both receptive and active capacities, intuitive and analytical intelligence, emotional and mental resources in balanced relationship. This integration creates what practitioners often describe as feeling more complete, or more whole, in ways that enhance all aspects of life experience. Advanced practitioners often develop what they describe as ongoing access to inner guidance that provides reliable direction for major life decisions and spiritual development. This guidance emerges not as external voices, but as enhanced sensitivity to which choices support long-term well-being and spiritual development, versus reactions based on conditioning or unconscious patterns. The Church's elimination of goddess practices created cultural amnesia about practical methods for accessing these consciousness capacities, leaving modern people dependent on external authorities for spiritual guidance and validation. Recovering these practices represents reclaiming spiritual autonomy that early Christians considered essential for mature faith development. The Gospel of Philip's technique provides one practical method for beginning this recovery process, while developing capacities for direct spiritual experience that ancient practitioners called gnosis, immediate knowing that transcends belief or doubt because it emerges from direct personal verification rather than external authority. This gnosis develops through embodied engagement with practices rather than intellectual study or emotional devotion alone. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual development requires integration of thinking, feeling, and sensing, capacities through techniques that work with the whole person, rather than isolated aspects of human function. The breathing component specifically engages what ancient texts call the gateway of the spirit, respiratory patterns that create optimal conditions for consciousness expansion while maintaining safety and integration. Modern breathwork research confirms that specific breathing rhythms consistently produce expanded awareness states while supporting nervous system health. The plant essence component works with sophisticated understanding of how aromatic compounds facilitate mystical experiences through direct interaction with brain chemistry. Ancient practitioners knew that almond blossoms contain specific molecules that, when properly extracted and inhaled during focused breathing, create ideal conditions for accessing expanded awareness. The recitation component provides rhythmic structure that helps maintain focus during consciousness expansion, while engaging what ancient practitioners called the creative power of sacred sound. Modern research into mantras and repetitive prayer confirms that rhythmic vocal practices create measurable brain state changes that support mystical experiences and psychological integration. The complete technique integrates these three components into unified practice that ancient communities used for both individual development and collective spiritual experiences. Group practice often produces what participants describe as profound feelings of connection, mutual understanding, and shared access to wisdom that transcends individual knowledge. The Gospel of Philip indicates that these group experiences provided practical foundation for the love and mutual support that characterized authentic early Christian community life. Instead of depending on charismatic leaders or institutional structures, communities could access ongoing spiritual guidance through collective engagement with practices that connected them directly with divine wisdom. Modern practitioners often form small groups that meet regularly to practice adapted versions of ancient techniques while providing mutual support for individual development. These contemporary spiritual communities often develop qualities of intimacy, authenticity, and mutual empowerment that contrast sharply with hierarchical structures and emotional superficiality that characterize many institutional religious organizations. The practice's accessibility means anyone can begin immediate experimentation without requiring extensive preparation, special equipment, or institutional permission. The basic breathing technique can be practiced anywhere. Plant essences can be obtained easily, and the recitation requires only willingness to speak traditional names for divine feminine consciousness. Initial experiences often involve subtle but noticeable shifts in awareness, emotional tone, and spiritual receptivity that become more pronounced with regular practice. Most practitioners notice significant changes within the first week of daily engagement, with major transformations typically emerging over months of sustained commitment. The Gospel of Philip emphasizes that consistent daily practice creates more lasting transformation than occasional intensive experiences. Ancient practitioners understood that spiritual development requires gradual rewiring of nervous system patterns through regular engagement with practices rather than dramatic breakthroughs that aren't integrated into daily life. The technique's simplicity reflects ancient wisdom about spiritual development. The most powerful practices often involve basic activities like breathing, smelling, and speaking that become transformative through specific applications rather than exotic procedures requiring special conditions or abilities. This accessibility explains why early Christian authorities worked systematically to eliminate these practices. Empowered individuals don't require institutional mediation for spiritual development.